That's exactly like it. Thank you. Okay, the preacher said, as he does, what we're going to be looking at this evening, which is Mark chapter 6. There are a lot of verses. Those of you that have looked at it, or those of you looking now, would see there are a lot of verses in Mark chapter 6. There are really three primary events that take place yet. Beginning with verse 14, as the pastor mentioned, there's, of course, John the Baptist. There's like 20 verses discussing John and his execution and the events around that. There's the feeding of the 5,000, and there's the Jesus walking on the water. And so, there's certainly things in each of those events that are recorded in the book of Mark, and especially, frankly, Mark presents these a little differently than the other synoptic gospels. So some things we can certainly discuss. I'm fine, and I'm sure everybody else will be as well if we, move through those and go to chapter 7. If we don't get that far, we don't. Mostly I need to avoid the preacher's criticism because he's a highly critical person. He's got a stronghold there. We need to pray for the preacher because he can, everybody knows. We've talked about it lots of times, so it's no big deal. All right, here we go. So I'm beginning with verse 14, and so of chapter 6. And it says, and King Herod heard of him, and of course this is referring to Jesus. We pick it up here from where we left off last week, and he's referring to Jesus. So King Herod heard of him, meaning Jesus, for his name was spread abroad, and he said that John the Baptist was risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. So Herod was saying that this one who's this miracle worker really is John the Baptist who's come back from the dead, and because he came back from the dead, that's why he's able to do these wonderful things, or all these special things. So Herod was persuaded it was John the Baptist. Others said it's Elias, and others said it's the prophet. It is a prophet, or as one of the prophets. But when Herod heard of it thereof, he said, "It's John." He insisted, "It's John whom I beheaded. He's risen from the dead." So Herod was insisting, regardless of what everybody else said, and regardless of the fact that it's almost difficult to imagine that he hadn't heard of Jesus while John was still alive. In other words, their ministries, we know, actually overlapped for some period of time before John was in prison. So I mean, he certainly must have heard that there's actually two people involved here. But whatever the case, Herod was persuaded that is John. And he was persuaded of that for a particular reason that probably will come to everybody if it hasn't already, and that is Herod had a serious guilty conscience. And of course we read in these next verses how that happened or why. And I'll stop as we go through those a little bit perhaps and discuss a couple of the things that we pick up as we go. But let's just do it that. Let's read the verses, and we'll stop and discuss some of those briefly. So, for Herod himself had sent forth and laid hold upon John and bound him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife, for he married her. So Philip was Herod's brother, and he had a wife named Herodias. What a name! And so he, whatever the case, he took his brother's wife and married her. And John said, "No, that's not appropriate to do. Shouldn't do that." For John, verse 18, had said unto Herod, "It is not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife." I'm not sure why Herod would have needed special help understanding that. I mean, I think he would have perhaps known that. But whatever the case, John called him out. He took his brother's wife, and John called him out on it. And ever how it affected Herod. And in Matthew, we read that that Herod was upset about this as well. Although we read some other thoughts that Herod had here, just a few verses here from Mark. Luke doesn't really talk about that so much. But whatever the case, it was Herodias who was really, really mad. I mean, she was incensed that John the Baptist would have the utter gall, to challenge what they had done. So she insisted, and therefore Herodias had a quarrel against him. I'm in verse 19, picking up there, and would have killed him, but she could not. I mean, she wanted his head is what she wanted. She was so upset that John the Baptist had called her out, and of course her new husband, on what they had done. That she was incensed. She wanted him. She would have killed him, but she could not. So look at the last of verse 19. For Herod, this tells us why she couldn't. For Herod feared John, verse 20, knowing that he was a just man and holy, and observed him And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. So here's what it says. Herod was well familiar with John the Baptist. He was well familiar with him. He knew what he was about. He knew the kinds of things that he said. He knew he was a just man. He knew that he was a holy man. He listened to him. He enjoyed listening to him, even though he said things many times that he really didn't want to hear. I have a couple other translations, which I think says this even more clearly. Some of you I know use the NIV. And here's what NIV says about it. When Herod heard John, he was greatly puzzled, yet he liked to listen to him. That's what NIV says. My go-to, one of the more modern translations, and I use that advisedly because I don't get my doctrine there, but I do. Many times I can get some additional insight by reading some of these others, called The Message. Here's what it says. Whenever he listened to him, he was miserable, and miserable with guilt, talking about Herod listening to John. Whenever he listened to me, he was miserable with guilt, and yet he couldn't stay away. Something in John kept pulling him back. And so what we know and what we get from all of these translations, certainly from King James as well, is that there was something about John's message that totally captured Herod's thoughts. He didn't want to hear him, but he wanted to hear him. He didn't appreciate what he had to say, but he needed to hear it. He just needed to hear that. And so that was Herodias wanted him out of the way, and Herod was not prepared to go there at all. He was totally persuaded this is not what should be done to this man. He should not be put to death. And he, in fact, enjoyed listening to him and interacting with him, even though he said things he didn't want to hear. I don't have any idea how that makes you feel about Herod. And Herod's got all sorts of marks against him as we read about him. But I think it's not unusual sometimes for people to want to hear what they know to be truth, even if that truth bites, and the truth bit Herod. But still, he wanted to hear him. So in other words, he was not prepared to put him to death. And when a convenient day came, I'm in verse 21 now, that Herod on his birthday made a supper to his lords, his high captains, and chief estates, a big party. Herod was going to have a party on his birthday. And when the daughter of the said Herodias came in, this is the next verse, of course, and danced and pleased Herod and them that sat with him, the king said unto the damsel, ask of me whatsoever thou wilt, and I will give it thee. Now, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the visual, but it might help us have an understanding that the daughter of his new wife came and danced for Herod. He danced for all of them. There were some Heralds and Howards there too. I'm just telling you, there was just a whole bunch of people. See, some of those people, that was their names. They all started with H. Pay attention, preacher. You should be taking notes. All right. So Herodias' daughter came and danced for these people, and Herod was pleased. Now I don't know. I can't describe to you that dance. I mean, I really can't. We're not told. I assume it was not ballroom dancing, probably not square dancing. Whatever the case, Herod and the people that were with him were taken by this young lady who danced. Ask, and here's what he said. Ask of me whatsoever thou wilt, and I will give it thee. Now, I have to tell you, that is a bizarre thing to say, it seems to me, but he followed it up, didn't he? That wasn't good enough for him. Look at the next verse. And he sware unto her, whatsoever thou ask of me, I will give it thee unto the half of my kingdom. So whatever was going through his mind, he was prepared to give up. I mean, he was prepared to give up half of his kingdom. Actually, as we read the next verses, it's possible he would have preferred to have given up the half of his kingdom as opposed to that which she actually asked for. But this is really, I guess, it's hard for me to visualize, hard for to imagine what must have been going through his mind for him to say something like that. And the fact of the matter is, somebody might say that today, for example, and then say, well, you know what, I'll tell you what I'm going to do instead. No. And he said, I swear, he was committed. He was committed to do whatever she asked. He was prepared to give her whatever she asked, even if it was half of his kingdom. What a thing to say. What a thing to say under any circumstances, let alone because of an event that took place over a relatively short period of time. He said that nevertheless, and you just have to visualize how utterly bizarre and foolish that was. She went forth, talking about this daughter again, and said unto her mother, what shall I ask? And she said, this would be Herodias, said, the head of John the Baptist. So the girl goes and says to Mama, said, Mama, I've got a promise that he must fulfill up to half of the kingdom. I mean, I can't imagine, again, what they might have done, Herodias and her daughter, or anybody, I guess, with half of his kingdom, but whatever. And Herodias said, you ask for the head of John the Baptist, because he's got to step up. He's got to step up. And so, sure enough, she comes back. She went forth and said, strike that. And she came in straightway with haste unto the king. I mean, she was in a hurry. She wanted to get him while he was still prepared to do what he had said. And asked, saying, I will that thou give me by and by. That means straight away, to wit, and anon. That means now. In a charger, the head of John the Baptist. And the king was exceeding sorry. I guess he was. You just glance back up at the verses again. He knew this was a holy man, that this was a just man, was a holy man. He did not want that to happen to this man. He had said no to execution prior to this time, but now, king was exceeding sorry. Yet for his oath's sake, and for the sake of those that sat with him, he would not reject her. He swore, you can have whatever you want, even on behalf of my kingdom, and all these people heard him. He had all these witnesses, and he was not prepared to go back on his word. So immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head be brought. And he, the executioner, went and beheaded him, John the Baptist, in the prison. Now, last week when as we were leaving, and I was just talking about John the Baptist coming up, and some thoughts I had about that. This obviously took place over a period of hours, maybe minutes. I mean, it just obviously took place fairly quickly. As far as we know, have every reason to believe that John the Baptist that began that evening doing whatever he did. He met with his disciples periodically, we know that. There have been some conversations involving his disciples, and so, he was in prison, and there he was, and I guess he knew, he would have some reason to know that Herod had some appreciation for him and for some of the things that he said, and respected him in some ways, or else he would have been killed long before. Now he's sitting there minding his own business. I'm sorry, I don't want to add to this too much, but we have no reason to believe that he wasn't, and all of a sudden this guy shows up with a sword and takes him out. Of all the events that happened to the people that were living at the time and close to this man, this must have been one of the more poignant things that happened. And the cause of it, it wasn't even because of anything that he had said. It wasn't because of anything that he had done. It wasn't because of any crime that he'd committed or anything. It was on a whim by a woman who was determined to have the person who would call her out on her sin taken out. That's what that was for. And the triggering event was ugly too. I'm sorry, that's ugly. That's ugly. Whatever happened there, whatever kind of a dance that was, it was ugly to have generated the kind of response that Herod had, and ultimately ended up with John losing his head. Now, we have a couple more verses on this. They brought his head in a charger and gave it to the damsel, and the damsel gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard of it, talking about John the Baptist's disciples, they came and took up his corpse and laid it in a tomb. That's the last we have of John the Baptist in this book. And in fact, as Mark gives us more, I was discussing with the preacher a little bit ahead of time. Mark is one of the reasons that people note his bless you. One of the reasons that the people note his a peculiarity about his gospel is because he tends to have less detail. He cuts to the chase a lot, and for a variety of reasons, perhaps, bless you again. So whatever the case, he tends to be. But in this particular case, he gives us more than the others do. Luke gives us practically nothing. Matthew gives us some of these events, but not to the extent that Mark does. So for whatever reason, we have got in this evening, about as much as we're likely to get or discover about what ultimately ended up with John the Baptist. But one of the things that I was brought to my attention while I was considering John, and I had talked about it, the book of Mark starts out with John the Baptist, you recall, as the book of John does. Well, excuse me. Of course, in the beginning was the Word, talking about Jesus in John, but almost immediately goes to John the Baptist, what talks about in the first chapter of the book of John. In any event, I don't know how much. I don't know if the preacher has ever. I mean, if he has, I guess I may have missed it. What he talks about John in a message, and I don't know how much we give thought to this, but here I just find this concept totally compelling. Jesus said, no greater man ever born of a woman than John the Baptist. Jesus said that. No greater man naturally born, he excluded himself, of course, was born of a woman. Matthew 11:11. And I want to tell you something. I mean, that itself is kind of remarkable. Moses, hello. Abraham, Daniel, David, Isaiah. No greater man born of a woman than John the Baptist. He was a special guy. I just got to tell you, John the Baptist was one special guy. And this was a ignominious, I'm not even sure that word fits here, but it's going to stay because that's the one I got. Ending to this great man, John the Baptist. Anybody with a thought or comment, question? Fair enough. So we go to the next verses. And the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things. This, of course, the apostles we're talking about the 12. And told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. You recall, or not recall, but in one of the earlier weeks, we talked about this is when Jesus sent them out. He named the 12. Fourth chapter, I think, whatever. He named the 12 and he sent them out and gave them power to cast out, to heal and to cast out demons. Some of you recall us having that conversation. So they return now. These are the 12, and this is altogether new subject. I mean, it's not related to John in any respect. So anyway, these 12 return and they tell him what they had done and what they had taught. And he said unto them, come ye apart. Hello, come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while, for there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. There was so much transpiring because of all the things that were happening at the time and all the people that were involved. It's like they didn't have time to eat. So he said, let's get away, and so we can have a little time for some rest. Incidentally, it's not a bad idea to do that sometimes. Sometimes people in the ministry and others sometimes get so involved in the things that are really, really important to do that they neglect some of the things that are important to do. And among those things would be to take time to eat, for God's sakes, and get away and get some leisure time sometimes. It's a good thing to do. In any event, so they departed into a desert place by ship privately. And the people saw them departing, and many knew him, I'm in verse 33 now, and ran afoot thither out of all the cities, and outwent them, and came together unto him. So they got this crowd gathered, and when they knew about Jesus, they knew who he was, they knew some of the things that he'd done, and the things that had the miracles he performed, and so these people came together. And look at this next verse. And when Jesus, when he came out, saw much people, and he was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as a sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. You know, I look at that, and I think of the fact that and everybody here, every single person here I know appreciates the fact that Jesus has compassion, and he is a compassionate Savior, is he not? Hello, class. Are we fortunate that Jesus is compassionate? The answer is yes. I'm going to help you with that one. So he had compassion. But when he saw the crowd, I don't know what you think about sometimes. Once in a while, I see a crowd. I see a bunch of people. And can I tell you something? I don't know all those individuals. I don't know certain others. But many people are like a sheep without a shepherd. And that's really one of the tragic things about our society as a whole. There's so many people And I want to tell you something. I don't know how you feel when you see those people, or when you recognize that because of some of the things maybe that are taking place within the crowd, or some of the motivations that put the crowd together, they're like a sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus would have compassion on them. He see those folks, he'd have compassion. And hello, class, we should too. We should be compassionate for those people, because that's exactly the way he was. So he saw these people, all these people, and he had compassion. Okay. He began to teach them many things. So he said, he taught. And when the day was now far spent, I'm in verse 35, when the day was now far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place. Now the time is far past. Send them away. Disciples talking to Jesus. They may go into the country round about in the villages and buy themselves bread. They have nothing to eat. These people, it's been a long day. They're out here hanging out. We're out here in a place where there's no place to get food. So let them go. Just send them away and let them go get something to eat. He answered, he, Jesus, and said unto them, the disciples, give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, the disciples said to Jesus, shall we go and buy 200 penny worth of bread and give them to eat? Now, 200 penny worth, you read different things about what that is, but it's something like a year's wages for a person who is a penny a day or whatever. And of course, we typically have work days our work days in a year are something like 220 or whatever. I don't know that it had all the legal holidays, but the point is it was a lot of money. So they said, how are we going to get this? What are we going to do? We're going to get all this money and go buy the food. And he saith unto them, how many loaves have ye? Go and see. So go check it out. He said, this is Jesus talking to his disciples. Go see it. And when they knew, they say 5 loaves, there were 5, and 2 fishes. Okay. And he commanded them to make all sit down by companies upon the green grass. And they sat down in ranks by hundreds and by 50s. And when he had taken the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven, he, Jesus, of course, and blessed, and brake the loaves, and gave them to his disciples, and set before them. 2 fishes divided he among them all. And they all did eat and were filled. And he took up the 12 baskets full of, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments and of the fishes. And they did eat of the loaves. There were about 5,000 men. Now, here we go. To this point, we've seen some things that Jesus has done. We've seen some miracles that he worked. We've seen him cast out demons, and we've seen the woman with the issue of blood touch the hem of his garment, and she was healed. And we've seen, the man that Ed referenced tonight. We had that in Mark as well. You recall when they let this guy's friends let him down through the roof and because they couldn't get in. So we've seen Jesus heal the sick, and we've seen him cast out demons, and we've seen him do a variety of things in almost every case involving one person at a time. Now, I want again, this is an event which transpired, and people think about it sometimes, I guess, when we hear the conversation about it. But when I read that, I'm sorry, this is totally, absolutely remarkable. Think about this, please. 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And, the way this ends, there were about 5,000 men. Most folks agree that was plus women and children. At this time, it wasn't talking about 5,000 people. Whatever the case, there was a lot of people. And he took these 5 loaves and 2 fishes and divided them up. Hello, if that would have netted 12 baskets of food, that would be a pretty remarkable miracle. He fed, they were all filled, 5,000 plus, and presumably the 12, and Jesus ate as well. So there was a lot of food. I don't know that there's ever been that there was during his ministry a time when more people at one single time, were impacted or witnesses to a miracle, certainly of that magnitude. I'm not diminishing, please. I hesitate to talk about this a little bit because I don't want to, if it sounds like I'm diminishing any of his miracles, then obviously I'm not. I'm miscommunicating. That's what I'm doing. But this one is remarkable, it seems to me, in the sense that it was so impossible to do what he did. And so many people were the recipients of that all at once. I mean, they had to have left there realizing what happened. It's just a remarkable miracle, the feeding of the 5,000. It's what we always refer to that. There was another feeding. It comes up later in Mark and in other places as well, a feeding of 4,000. But I guess that just, the crowd wasn't as big or whatever the case. I'm sure he could have handled a bigger crowd. But the fact of the matter is, this is a remarkable miracle to me because there were so many people impacted by it, so many witnesses to it, and it was so impossible. It was impossible. Not to suggest that casting out a demon is not, or healing the sick. I'm not suggesting that. But this one's unique in the sense that so many people were impacted, it seems to me, in such a short period of time. So there they were. And they gathered up the 12 baskets. I don't know. People have suggested why they might have gathered up the 12 baskets. Why does anybody have any idea why that might have been? 12 disciples. There you go. I've heard that. I don't know whether it had anything to do with it or not, or whether, so that they had something to take with them. I don't know. I don't know. There was 12. I know that. There was 12, and baskets left over from 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And, I'm sorry? There you go. Scraps. But I would tell you, they were left over. And whatever the case, a lot of people were blessed by that miracle, and all at one time. And it's the first time, certainly, that he'd done anything quite like that. Really, it's no wonder there's a lot of people who, I guess, are concerned about others for a variety of reasons, but a lot of people like to be fed, and it could be one of the reasons, of course, that he had good crowds. People think, I can only get fed, which is not unimportant, certainly in some circumstances. Whatever the case, that's the miracle. Anybody on the feeding of the 5? Say 5 because that's the number we have. Again, almost everybody agrees there was more than, some say as many as 20 with women and children. I don't know how many there were. Can I tell you something? It really doesn't matter. He could feed 5, he could feed 50,000. So, he just, and there might have been more baskets of scraps left over. So whatever the case, anybody on this one? Okay. Yeah. Well, clearly God has done impossible things for us, and we've witnessed God do impossible things for other people. I don't know and first of all, I just need you to know that there's a ton of things that I don't know, and if there's somebody here who had any wonder about that, I'm about to disabuse you of that notion, or if anybody hasn't picked it up so far, there's a ton of things I don't know, but I'm a little disquieted by the fact that Jesus increased in faith. I think that Jesus was God, and I think he had faith. He had faith because he was God. He had faith. Now, Luke 2:52, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature. He grew physically, and in favor with God. He grew spiritually, and man socially. So those are the things that he grew. And I don't know. I always supposed, and I guess I still sort of do, that his faith was his faith. And we really, and to this side of heaven, I don't think we're going to have his faith. We certainly can get. Our faith can increase as we witness the things that he did. But I'm a little disquieted by the notion that his faith grew because when he saw what God did through him, I think that he was God, and so he generally would know what that was. But that's another view, and I appreciate your view. Anybody else with another thought on the 5,000? Or I got 2 others. So there we go, Harry, and then we'll come to the back. Go. I got it. I don't know that he was volunteering to lead an army, but I can picture that people would want him to be, and frankly, the Romans and Herod might have been concerned as anybody might have been, that he was going to lead an uprising because he had all those people to follow him. And he certainly demonstrated his power, this one being slightly different. Yes, we have a comment. Yes. Point taken, and point taken. So I don't, John generally doesn't track some of the things that the other three synoptic gospels do, but he certainly mentions this. There's some things that John has that one or two of the others have as well. But the three that are the closest to having all of them, they have the most in common. Let me say it that way, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But John does this one as well, and thanks for pointing it out. Anybody else with a thought or comment before we go on? Yes, Ed? You know what, I'm sorry, I missed part of that, Ed, and I want all of it. So I'm sorry, do it again, please. Yeah, totally. And since we believe in the triune God and that Jesus and the Holy Spirit and God the Father were present at creation, and he knew what he needed to know and what he was going to be doing. He understood those things, and it was his purpose to fulfill the will of God. No question about it. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
The other thing that's kind of interesting about this is several of these miracles that Andrew was the bringer. He brought the boy, he brought the soldiers, he had his hand in a lot of this that without him bringing under, and God had this plan, of course, but this wouldn't have happened either.
I get where you're saying Andrew was the bringer. He brought Peter. So clearly, the Lord uses people like Andrew, and he might use people like I'm looking at here somewhere, to do those kinds of things and to bring people, and he uses those folks to bring folks to the Lord. And so Andrew was certainly one of them. Appreciate the thought. Anybody else with a thought before we? Yes, Norm. Well, you know what? That view of the radio speaker has certainly as much value as my views, and so I'm happy you got something from that. And you know what? It's possible. Okay, Harry, I'm sorry. I'll get you in a second. Yeah, certainly. If she'd have known that we were all going to hear about this, she might have stuck some jelly on those loaves or something, or puts in give it a little dessert there. Put a Hostess cupcake in there. So I'm sorry. Something that to some fruit. Come on, Mom. We're going to get this story out. So essentially, yes, Harry.
My old boss used to say that this was the greatest miracle in the entire Bible. Maybe make the apple and a Hostess cake.
So
You're losing control. Would you get it, Rip?
So this is what I get when I stop and ask for questions and or comments. I think we're going to go on, but just because. All right, here we go. All right, and straightway, I'm on verse 45, and I'm pretty sure that's where I am. And straightway he constrained his disciples, Jesus, constrained his disciples to get into the ship and go to the other side before unto Bethsaida while he sent the people away. So he said, you guys get in the boat and take off, and I'm going to send the people away. And when he sent them away, he departed into a mountain to pray. This had been, of course, a big day, and they started this day with the expectation of getting some downtime or some away time, some alone time, whatever. But I thought, and this maybe go to some of the comments we'd had a little earlier, we're talking about Jesus and his relationship to the Father. But whatever the case, he went by himself to pray. And can I tell you that if there is a tool, if there is an asset that we have been provided that does not get as much use as clearly it could, this would have to be one of those things. If Jesus found it important to get away and pray, chances are it would be of value to us as well. And I have to tell you that whenever this comes up, I'm convicted about it. I really am. That this resource that we have, I think that many times it's almost perfunctory. And if that doesn't apply to you, bless your hearts. Then it doesn't, and I'm glad it doesn't. Whenever I read that Jesus went somewhere to pray by himself, I'm thinking, you know what? If it had value to him, if it was worth him investing his time and his effort, you know what? Chances are it would benefit me more. And I think of that. I saw that verse, and it has to come to it. And when even was come, this is at night now, the ship was in the midst of the sea, and he alone on the land. So he sent the disciples in the boat, and they were on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw them toiling and rowing, for the wind was contrary unto them. About the fourth watch of the night, so it's in the night, he cometh unto them walking upon the sea, and would have passed them by. He was going to. They were struggling because the wind was contrary to them, and they were trying to get to where they were going, and so it was. I guess they're just going slowly, or he was going fast, or whatever. But anyway, he caught up with them, and he was going to go right on by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it had been a spirit, and they cried out. For they all saw him and were troubled. And immediately he talked with them and saith unto them, Be of good cheer, but it is I, be not afraid. And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased. And they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. For they considered not the miracle of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. Now, let's focus on these last couple verses. First of all, they saw him, and they thought it was a spirit, and they were troubled. Can I share something with you? Under the same circumstances, we might have been troubled as well. I'm sorry. We might have been troubled as well. But as we get the context and the flow of these two verses, he said, "Don't be afraid. It's I. It is I. Everything's fine." So he gets into the boat, and the wind ceases, and they were amazed. And they were amazed, and they were amazed. Now it tells us why they were amazed, because they didn't think about this. They didn't think about the miracle they had just witnessed. Now, here's the thing. We had a conversation a little bit when we were talking about prayer earlier when Ed was here, and then also some things that some folks had commented on a little earlier about faith growing. B is one of the ones that mentioned that, I guess. But here's what happened. They had just witnessed this miracle, and that's on all four Gospels. Not they would have known that, but this remarkable event where all these people were fed with just meager meal. And yet, when Jesus gets in the boat and the wind ceases, that they were surprised, that they had forgotten. Please, this is the point, or I think it's the point. This is the point. They had just seen God work in a mighty way, and they forgot. I mean, we're talking now within hours. Within hours, they didn't remember what an unbelievable turn of events they had just been part of. And so he walks on the water, he gets in the boat, the wind ceases, and they're amazed because their hearts were hardened. They forgot. Now, I'm reasonably sure of this assertion which I'm about to make, and that is, we forget. We forget. We forget. There's a verse, and Trish and I take it out of context frequently, because it applies in our view to several different contexts. And it's we remember the pit from which we were digged. Where is that, baby? You remember? It's in Isaiah. Okay, fair enough. But and we sometimes forget the pit from which we were digged. Can I tell you something? Everyone here tonight who's a believer has been digged out of a pit. Have been digged out of a pit. And sometimes we forget. And sometimes when we pray, We pray without, or we go before the Lord without the kind of faith that we have because we forget. We forget. All of us, we had this conversation just a few moments ago, have had miracles happen in our own life. We have. Or we would be somewhere else involved in something else, were it not for a miracle that took place in our own life. And we've seen other miracles. We've seen other times. We've seen other examples when there was no explanation for it except God was involved in a particular situation. We've seen those times, and yet we forget. And we just do. And because of that, sometimes when we see the Lord work again, it's kind of like, whoa, he did what? When clearly that should have come to our mind first of all. First of all, like these disciples, it's like they had to learn it all over again. They had just seen what they saw, and they forgot. It did not make the impression on them that one might have thought it might. I don't know how you'd ever quite get over that miracle. That was a big one. Now, of course, I'm sorry, this is too. Hello, this is too. But they've seen lots of miracles. I'm sorry, they've seen many miracles. Hello, class. And they themselves, through the power that had been given them by Jesus, cast out demons and healed the sick. They did. They came back and told them about it just a few verses ago. We talked about that. They had seen all of these things, but for some reason, they were still taken back by the fact that he walked on the water, got in the boat, and the wind and the waves ceased. And we're specifically told why, because their hearts have been hardened, that they disregarded, or they had already neglected to remember what they had seen with the feeding of the 5,000. Our reaction might be, mine is, I sort of just implied it was. How could they be so short-sighted? How could I be so short-sighted? How could I have been a witness to so many wonderful things that the Lord has done in my life, and those that are important to me, and those that are close to me, and those that I've witnessed, and still be surprised sometimes when I see the Lord intervene and be involved? How could I be so short-sighted? But they sure enough were, and it tells us why they were. It's the third event that is covered beginning this evening with John and with the feeding of the 5 and the walking on the water. The third one of these 3 events that were yet to be discussed this evening, and we are sure enough running short on time. But listen, if you want to talk about the loaves and fishes, we've already passed that. So let's don't go back to the lunch. But is anybody who wants to who has a thought or comment or a question about the walking on the water and the disciples' reaction, given the fact that they had just been part of this other miracle? Anybody with a thought or comment on this? Yes, ma'am. Certainly the language that's used to describe Pharaoh's heart is that God hardened his heart. Certainly the language used to describe it, in this translation and others as well, is similar, that they had hard hearts. But we know the end of these 11 of the 12. We know the end of the 12th as well, don't we, of the 12. But the 11 of the 12 certainly, because of events that transpired later on, which we'll talk about in Mark, or we won't, but the events transpired later on, they're certainly hearts softened in a hurry. Provided the things that they witnessed with the death, burial, and resurrection, for example, their hearts changed, and they were indwelt by the Holy Spirit. And then their hearts became soft, and certainly that Holy Spirit can work the same work in our hearts as well. Anybody else another thought on these? Well, preacher, I hate to say this, and I really do hate to say this, but I can't imagine you get this right. I'm going to do my best to finish this thing here. And when they had passed over, so when they had passed over, the disciples, they came to the land of Gennesaret and drew to the shore. And when they came out of the ship, straightway they knew him. So the people there knew him as well, and ran throughout the whole region round about, began to carry about in beds those that were sick, where they heard he was. And whithersoever he entered into villages or cities or country, They laid the sick in the streets and besought him they might touch him, if it were but the border of his garment. As many as touched him were made whole. Now, I have italicized when I copy and paste the version here on my notes. I can do things to it so it reminds me to mention it. But I look at the last line, preacher. That would preach. That would preach. Now, our preacher is an expository preacher, for which I'm very grateful. I know people who have topical sermons, and what they frequently will do sometimes, not all of them, certainly not all of them, but they'll pick a topic they kind of like this, and they'll find some verses that they think fit that, and if they have to shoehorn those verses in, they're going to, because they got a point they want to make. But that's not fair to say with all the topical messages. But I want to tell you something. If this was a topical message, this one would really work. Would it work or not? As many as touched him were made whole. That's a great line. That's a great line. Even out of context, it still works. Did you know that? It still works. Made whole. You can be made whole. You get hold of Jesus, you'll be made whole. You'll be made whole. So I'm always careful about those things, but once in a while I see a line and think, whoa, that sucker would preach. You can picture that one really having a good message about that. And it happens to be true in context beyond the one that was here. So this was an exciting time in the ministry. Next week, we're going to be talking, Lord willing, about chapter 7. You will not want to miss a single second of next week's exciting discussion on chapter 7. Got some Pharisees back working at Jesus again. Well, them Pharisees, they don't give up easily. And he gets a little tough on his own disciples, actually, in chapter 7 as well. So I think we've run out of time. And there you have it. So, preacher, I'm going to let you do what you do, which is